Hi folks, I'd like to make a quick video about Islamophobia. I think it's an important issue because there's been an increase in Islamophobic attacks, and Islamophobia is weaponized against progressive politicians like Zoran Mamdani and Abdul El Sayed, and also because Islamophobia contributes to turning a blind eye to the genocide in Gaza and the escalation of the war with Iran, which are absolutely disastrous to say the least. I'll first try to steelman the other perspective a little bit. I think that sometimes progressive liberals will decry Islamophobia with the sort of line of thinking that, it's an identity marker for a minority group, so you should basically just not say anything bad about it just to be nice. But obviously, if you're not a Muslim, there's going to be things that you're going to disagree with that you might find harmful on an individual or collective level. If you're a Christian like me, you'll prefer your own religious tradition, or if you're an atheist, you might have disdain for all religions, including Islam, right? But having critiques and even believing that the religion is bad for one reason or another is not Islamophobia. And I'll show this by introducing my own criticisms at the end of the video to prove that I'm not just like part of the woke mob or whatever. But what I do think constitutes Islamophobia is when you exhibit undue prejudice against Muslims, and this happens when you forget that they are also people, and you flatten out their identity and reduce it to just their religion, and forget that like anyone else, they form their identity and worldview in a broader social context, which in turn affects how they interact with their religion. And I'll explain more about what I mean by that later as I go through three main issues with Islamophobia. Two of them are sort of logical problems, and the third is a pair of tactical or pragmatic issues. One of the most common sort of Islamophobic arguments that I'll see is that someone will take some random Quran scripture that looks bad when taken at face value, maybe something about killing infidels or whatever, and the idea is that if Muslims believe in the Quran, then they must endorse wanton violence in a way that is incompatible with modern society. Now, for any individual example, if you want to know how to interpret that verse benignly or whether it's been taken out of context, you'll have to ask a Muslim. But my issue is with the form of the critique, because Islamophobes are not merely saying why they don't like the religion, but they're also trying to make a point that Muslims as people are necessarily or very likely to be problematic. So the problem is that even if the face value reading of the text is bad, and even if believers have to go through mental gymnastics to try to reinterpret the scripture in a benign way, the fact is that people are people, and many of them will go through those mental gymnastics. That is because even if a religion claims not to be, all religions are subject to interpretation, and when adherents of a religion interpret it, they inevitably bring themselves to the interpretation. And people do have some instinctual moral sentiments, and they are subject to a surrounding culture that is affected by a lot of different historical dynamics, of which religion is only a part. So even if it would be incoherent of somebody to interpret the religion or that particular scripture in a benign way, people are incoherent. They always have the option of going for the old reliable and saying, oh, it's just a metaphor, for example. To prove this point, we can take a look at the other two Abrahamic religions. In 1 Samuel 15:3 and Deuteronomy 20:16 and 17, the face value interpretation is that God is commanding genocide and the murder of innocent people. I remember talking with an evangelical who believes in biblical inerrancy, and he was like, yup, genocide is acceptable in rare cases if God commands, I guess, but trust me, he'd never command that today. Are these texts problematic? Yeah. But should we conclude that all or most Christians or Jews must therefore be violent and unfit for modern society? No, of course not. Because they are people with feelings and intuitions that tell them not to kill, and more than likely they'll try to engage in some sort of mental gymnastics to square the circle. And in the same way that Christianity is up for different interpretations, we see people interpret Islam differently, with regards to modesty standards for women, for example. And to any atheists watching smugly from the sideline, everybody gangsta until they take a philosophy course in college and they realize how much of what they believed is contradictory. For example, I don't see how you can get like moral realism from the sort of traditional materialism that the average atheist probably buys into, and that would remove the rationality for being moral. But like, do I think atheists are going to be necessarily immoral? No, like even if I'm correct in my critique, they're more likely to just be incoherent and hold strong moral beliefs anyway. So being wrong about abstract stuff is part of human nature, but also having baseline instincts for being nice and cooperative is as well. So it's totally fair to critique ideas, and ideas matter, but what I'm saying is don't just reduce people to their religious creed. It's only one part of what's going on with them, and those problematic parts may only be a small part of that person's own engagement with their religion to begin with. In other words, it's probably not what they focus on anyway. Another common Islamophobic talking point is to point to various Muslim-majority countries that are backward in some way or another and say that this must be due to their religion, and therefore Muslims must all be like this. And there are plenty of good options to pick, right? Like you have like Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan and Iran. These are not bastions of civil rights and gender equity, and their religious tradition, is part of their story. But it's only one part of that story. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to explain how Muslim-majority countries like Indonesia, Albania, and Bosnia and Herzegovina are better off than Afghanistan. History and politics play a role in the overall culture and the interpretation of the religion itself. A good example of this is Iran, which, under Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, had a secular progressive government. But what happened there? Well, we didn't like them taking control over their own oil, so we did a coup and replaced him with the Shah, who was a terrible dictator. In the aftermath, the Ayatollah eventually got power, and then we have the same goofballs in charge today. Another good example of this would be Afghanistan. There was a secular communist government in charge, but we didn't like that either, so we literally armed the religious fundamentalist Mujahideen rebels, and we even bought textbooks for the children that taught them a fundamentalist strain of Islam. It's almost like too on the nose to be true. So does this mean that people can't use Islam to present obstacles to societies trying to become more progressive? No, people have used Christianity to hold society back. The task of improving conditions and reinterpreting the religion is on their shoulders, but just boiling it down to a function of their religion is something that only historically illiterate people do. So, as mentioned earlier, there are also some pragmatic issues with being Islamophobic, and I'll speak to two perhaps overlapping groups of people. Firstly, people who are concerned about religious fundamentalism and think that Islam will threaten our secular values, and secondly, to Christians who don't see any reason to be happy about another religion getting a stronger foothold here in our country. So, to those concerned about fundamentalism, obviously, fundamentalist Islam is nothing to coddle, but religious fundamentalism of all stripes is dangerous, and it is fundamentalist Christians who hold all the levers of power in America. Not to sound like a Reddit atheist here, but these fundamentalist evangelical Christians are driving forward almost everything that is wrong in our society today. Keep your eye on the ball. They're the ones who are mindlessly supporting Donald Trump while he takes us into another disastrous war in the Middle East and shreds the Constitution while his fascist paramilitary force, unaccountable to the law, murders people and rounds them up in concentration camps. They're the ones sending our tax dollars to Israel while these Israeli settlers literally kick people out of their homes and shoot their kids because God promised them that land 3,000 years ago. Like, these are the people you need to oppose. It's not Muslims doing any of that. Distracting people by scapegoating Muslims is the right-wing rhetorical equivalent of jangling keys in front of a baby. You can't let yourself be dumb enough to fall for it. I'm sorry, it's just not acceptable. And I will take some random Muslim guy over an evangelical nutjob as my neighbor any day of the week. Now, issue number 2. To Christians who want to preserve the Christian character of our country, what are you whining about when Muslims move here? The mission field is literally coming to you. Now is your chance to convert them. How are you supposed to be doing that if you're reviling them and demonizing them? Show them what Christian discipleship looks like. When Paul went to Athens, did he just say, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very terrible and you are making this country suck? No, he tried to build off of common ground while preaching the gospel. And you have way more in common with Muslims than pagan Greeks. Lastly, I'll close with making some of my own criticisms of Islam like I said I would at the start, right? So there's a couple things that I don't like. Obviously, I'm not a big fan of the modesty requirements, and strains of the religion that make women wear head-to-toe burqas are off-putting to say the least. If people wear a headscarf where they get to pick different colors and express themselves individually and show their face, like, that's all cool, right? But compulsory head-to-toe covering is not something that has a place in our society. And I don't think that we should have to walk on eggshells when saying that. Secondly, Muslims believe that the Quran is inerrant. While many Christians believe this about the Bible, I think that Christianity has a lot easier of a time accepting the fallibility of Scripture because the center is the life, example, and teachings of Jesus, not the Bible itself. So you can see important figures in Christian history rejecting biblical inerrancy, and I think this allows people to be more self-aware and honest about the whole interpretation process that I talked about earlier. At any rate, with that said, I'll bring this rant to a close. Thanks to everyone who listened this far. Leave a comment and hit like if you like this video. Until next time, this has been a Nerdy Tree production.